Something just shifted along one of the most volatile corridors on the planet, and almost no one saw it coming with this level of consequence. The country Iran believed it could pressure into silence just transformed itself into the anchor of a new regional security architecture, one that is tightening around Tehran from three directions simultaneously. Turkey did not simply defend its airspace. It triggered a chain reaction that is rewriting the military, diplomatic, and humanitarian map of the Middle East in real time. This is not a localized border incident. This is not a temporary escalation that fades within a news cycle. What is unfolding right now represents the collapse of a strategy Tehran has relied on for years. The calculated use of ambiguity, plausible deniability, and asymmetric pressure to keep its neighbors off balance and deterred. That strategy has just failed in the most visible and consequential way possible. To understand how we arrived here and why the fallout is far larger than the immediate headlines suggest, we have to go back to the night of March 13th, and why that night was categorically different from everything that came before it. Air raid sirens activated at Incirlik Air Base in Adana, not for a drill, not for a scheduled exercise, for an incoming missile. By the time the burning debris fell across the night sky, residents below were already recording it on their phones, the footage spreading across social media before any official statement had been issued. Turkey's NATO-integrated air defense network had intercepted the incoming threat. But this was not the first time. It was the third. And that number, 3, is precisely what changed everything. The first incident had been explained away. The second had drawn a sharp diplomatic warning from Ankara, with President Erdogan publicly confirming that incoming ballistic missiles had been neutralized in a timely manner and that the necessary warnings had been conveyed to the Iranian side. The language was restrained but unmistakable. Patience was running out. Tehran responded both times the same way it responds to inconvenient facts: denial, misdirection, and suggestions that the missiles had simply drifted off course or that third parties might be responsible. The third strike made denial structurally impossible, because the target this time was Incirlik itself, NATO's most critical nuclear storage and logistics hub in the region. This is not a base a missile stumbles onto by accident. It is one of the most heavily monitored, radar-tracked, and geopolitically sensitive installations on the planet. Turkey's radar systems captured the full trajectory. The launch origin was traceable. Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli had already drawn a formal red line on behalf of the Turkish state, declaring publicly that no missile or unmanned aerial vehicle would be tolerated in Turkish airspace or the airspace of Azerbaijan, whether attributed to navigational error or deliberate action. That statement carried the weight of the broader Turkish political establishment, and it was delivered clearly enough that no one could credibly claim misunderstanding. What happened next moved at a speed that revealed exactly how prepared NATO had been for this scenario. A Patriot air defense battery was dispatched from Ramstein Air Base in Germany under an emergency deployment code. Its destination, the Kuraçik radar installation in Malatya, deep in south-central Turkey. To understand why Kuraçik matters more than almost any other facility in the region, you need to understand what it does. The site houses a US-operated AN/TPY-2 X-band radar, the forward-deployed brain of NATO's ballistic missile defense architecture in this theater. When a ballistic missile is launched from Iranian territory, this radar detects it within seconds of launch. Not at altitude, not mid-flight, at the moment of launch. It relays tracking data in real time to Aegis-equipped destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean, and those destroyers deploy SM-3 interceptor missiles capable of destroying an incoming threat outside the atmosphere before it ever reaches its target. On March 4th, March 9th, and March 13th, the Kuraçik radar served as the detection backbone of that system, enabling the destruction of all 3 Iranian ballistic threats before they reached their intended impact zones. The implication for Tehran's military doctrine is direct and severe. Iran's deterrence model has always depended on a combination of precision, surprise, and psychological effect. If every launch is detected the moment it leaves its platform, and if the weapon is destroyed before reaching its target, that deterrence model collapses entirely. What Iran demonstrated across these 3 incidents is not military capability. It is military exposure. Each launch revealed trajectory data, launch coordinates, range parameters, and system limitations to the very intelligence networks it was attempting to intimidate. The Turkish Ministry of National Defense formally declared that the missile defense doctrine for the region was now fully integrated and operational. Patriot batteries positioned at Malatya, SM-3 measures reinforced at Incirlik. Kurachik shifted to continuous 24-hour active scanning across the full eastern threat corridor. None of these systems existed at this level of forward-deployed readiness on Turkey's eastern perimeter before the Iranian launches began. Tehran, in its attempt to apply pressure, achieved the precise opposite of its strategic goal. It had accelerated the deployment of the most advanced ballistic missile defense infrastructure in the world directly onto its own border. It had thickened the armor of the country it was trying to intimidate. But the defensive component, significant as it is, represents only one dimension of what Turkey has set in motion. The real story, the one with longer-term consequences extending far beyond this immediate crisis, is what has begun to take shape along Iran's northern frontier. Azerbaijan's Ministry of Defense issued a formal statement declaring that the missile strikes directed toward Turkey constituted a direct threat to regional stability. Read that carefully. This is not symbolic diplomatic solidarity. This is Baku, which shares a 765-kilometer land border with Iran, formally positioning itself as an active stakeholder in how the situation develops. The military and intelligence establishments in Baku understand that an Iranian missile that loses its intended trajectory toward Turkey does not need to travel far to reach Azerbaijani airspace. That awareness has accelerated discussions that were already underway, but now carry an urgency that did not previously exist. According to reports emerging from the region, the armed forces of Turkey and Azerbaijan are in active discussions regarding joint military exercises in Nakhchivan, the Azerbaijani exclave pressed directly against Iran's northwestern border. A Turkish military delegation visited Nakhchivan in the immediate aftermath of the escalation. That visit was not procedural. It is the most visible evidence that these discussions have moved from the conceptual stage into active operational preparation. Nakhchivan's geography demands a moment of careful attention. It is an exclave, a piece of Azerbaijani sovereign territory physically separated from Azerbaijan's main body, enclosed between Turkey, Armenia, and Iran, its southern edge pressed directly against Iran's most sensitive and historically restive northwestern provinces. For years, Tehran has monitored the deepening Turkey-Azerbaijan military relationship with growing concern, understanding that meaningful integration along this corridor directly challenges the security of its northern interior. Iranian drones were shot down in this border region in recent weeks, a signal of how actively Tehran was already trying to manage events there. The joint exercise discussions, if they proceed to a formal timeline, would include elements that are operationally significant far beyond symbolic force demonstration. Joint command and control protocols, testing coordinated operational capacity within the same theater. Humanitarian corridor and border management procedures designed for large-scale civilian displacement. Technical integration of Turkish air defense systems with Azerbaijani radar networks. And cross-border ground force maneuver exercises, which is a direct operational rehearsal of buffer zone establishment and control. That last component is not peripheral to the developing story. It is central to what this situation is building toward. Now add a third actor, and the strategic landscape shifts again in ways that are difficult for Tehran to absorb. Reports, still developing and not yet confirmed at the official level, which is itself a significant detail, indicate that Pakistani military participation in the Nakhchivan exercise discussions has been signaled. Pakistan is not a peripheral variable. It shares a 959-kilometer land border with Iran's eastern frontier. It maintains an active military force of approximately 650,000 personnel, larger than Iran's own army. It possesses a declared nuclear capability that fundamentally alters the deterrence calculus in any scenario where it participates. And Pakistan and Iran have not shared genuine stability in decades. Sustained friction in the Sistan-Baluchistan corridor, mutual intelligence operations, and sectarian rivalry have been constant sources of tension that culminated dramatically in January 2024, when the two countries launched missile and drone strikes against each other's territory. demonstrating to the world exactly how fragile the eastern Iranian frontier actually is. What amplifies Pakistan's potential involvement is the trajectory of its military relationship with Turkey. Over the past decade, that relationship has grown substantive. Joint defense industry projects, naval exercises, intelligence sharing, and doctrinal alignment that is quiet in profile, but meaningful in operational depth. If Islamabad confirms participation in the Nakhchivan structure, it signals that this bond is taking on a coordinated operational dimension at exactly the moment Iran is most constrained. Now stand back and read the map from above. To the west, Turkey, sharing a 534-kilometer border with northwestern Iran, operating NATO's second-largest land army, hosting Incirlik and Kurachik, running Patriot batteries and an ANTPY-2 radar that detects Iranian launches at ignition, with a decade of cross-border operational experience. To the north, Azerbaijan, sharing a 765-kilometer border, Turkey's closest military ally, carrying operational experience from the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh campaign. Proof that coordinated Turkish drone integration with ground forces works at scale in high-intensity conflict. To the east, Pakistan, with 959 kilometers of border, a military larger than Iran's, nuclear deterrence, and a potential operational alignment with Ankara that did not exist at this level 18 months ago. If these three actors achieve meaningful coordination, not a formal treaty, simply coordinated forward positioning, Iran faces multi-directional strategic pressure it has no historical template for managing. Tehran has spent decades preparing for confrontation from the west and southwest, building long-range ballistic systems and proxy networks across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. It has not built a comparable architecture for its northern and eastern frontiers simultaneously. Those borders have historically been its relative areas of stability. That assumption is no longer valid, and now the crisis is expanding into a humanitarian dimension with its own independent strategic weight, one that changes the political calculation in ways that are distinct from pure military pressure. The figure circulating in UN and Turkish government assessments requires serious attention. 3.2 million people have been displaced in the regions most directly affected by the ongoing conflict. Hundreds are crossing the Kapakoi border crossing between Turkey and Iran every single day, and the volume continues to increase. Turkish Interior Minister Mustafa Şimşek has confirmed that plans are in place to receive displaced populations in buffer zones and temporary facilities along the border, a framework referencing the model Turkey developed during the Syrian displacement crisis. A 380-kilometer barrier system along the Iranian border has been under active construction at a pace reflecting long-term operational expectation, not emergency improvisation. Surveillance technology, cameras, sensors, drone monitoring networks has been integrated into the border management architecture. If conflict inside Iran escalates and civilian infrastructure in the northwestern provinces begins to fail, water systems, electricity, fuel, hospital capacity, the displacement wave would no longer be measured in hundreds daily. It would be measured in hundreds of thousands, moving toward Turkey and Azerbaijan. This intersection between the Nakhchivan exercise discussions and the humanitarian crisis management framework is not a coincidence of timing. It is the same strategic logic expressing itself across two domains simultaneously. Since 2016, through Euphrates Shield, Olive Branch, Peace Spring, and Claw operations in northern Iraq, Turkey has built and refined a doctrine for establishing controlled buffer zones on the sovereign territory of neighboring states, neutralizing security threats before they reach Turkish territory, and managing large-scale displacement at its source. A buffer zone established beyond Iran's northwestern border under joint Turkish and Azerbaijani management would accomplish both simultaneously. It would create a controlled corridor for refugee movement, establish a physical security perimeter, and create a persistent military presence in a region Tehran has always treated as exclusively within its own sphere of influence. The terrain presents real challenges: Zagros mountain extensions, high-altitude passes, winter logistics. These are constraints the Turkish military has encountered and adapted to across a decade of cross-border operations. Difficult, not prohibitive. There is a dimension of this situation that has received insufficient attention. When Iran fired missiles toward Turkey on 3 occasions in 10 days, It did not consult its most powerful international partners before doing so. Russian strategic analysts have framed the problem directly. Iran's actions prompted NATO to deploy its most advanced air defense architecture into Turkey, positioned at the foot of the Caucasus, a region Russia views as critically sensitive, particularly while managing an ongoing conflict in Ukraine. NATO infrastructure is now more forward deployed and better integrated on Russia's southern flank than it was 3 weeks ago. The military deepening between Turkey and Azerbaijan, two countries whose Caucasus alignment Russia has been working to constrain, is now accelerating. Beijing's concern runs on a different track but carries comparable weight. China's energy security depends on stable Middle Eastern supply routes. Its Belt and Road corridors run through Turkey, Pakistan, and Central Asian networks bordering the current instability zone. Strait of Hormuz disruptions have already affected Chinese energy supply chains. An expanding regional crisis drawing NATO further in is precisely the outcome that threatens Beijing's infrastructure most directly. The silence from both Moscow and Beijing has been observed carefully in every relevant capital. It is not the silence of endorsement, it is the silence of calculation. Both powers assessing not how to protect Iran, but how to protect their own interests from the consequences of Iran's decisions. Tehran is navigating this crisis without meaningful great power cover. Now bring the full picture into focus. 3 missiles in 10 days. 3 denials that convinced no one. 3 NATO responses that left Iran in a strategically worse position after each incident than before it. The attempt to pressure Turkey produced a Patriot deployment from Germany, full activation of the Kurachik network, Aegis destroyer coverage in the eastern Mediterranean, and a formal declaration that the regional missile defense doctrine is now operational. The attempt to demonstrate deterrent capability demonstrated the opposite. 3 intercepted missiles revealed to the world that Iran's ballistic systems are not effective against a modern integrated air defense architecture. The accumulated cycle of denials, each "we didn't do it," each suggestion of third-party interference, each claim of navigational error, has reduced Tehran's credibility on security matters to a level it will not recover from quickly. Diplomatic capital that took years to build has been spent in days. The attempt to isolate Turkey produced a strengthened Turkey-Azerbaijan military axis, activated Nakhchivan exercise planning, brought Pakistan into the strategic equation as a potential operational participant, and created a 3-front pressure framework that Iran is now required to plan against for the first time in its modern strategic history. The humanitarian crisis is not a separate story running in parallel. It is the ground-level expression of the same strategic collapse. 3.2 million displaced, hundreds crossing daily at Kapakoi, a 380-kilometer barrier system activating buffer zone planning underway, UN aircraft operating over Turkish airspace as global crisis management mechanisms engage. These are the human and institutional consequences of decisions made in Tehran that are now running beyond Tehran's ability to manage or reverse. What has fundamentally changed is this. Iran entered this period with a doctrine based on calibrated pressure, asymmetric deterrence, and the assumption that its neighbors would remain individually deterred and collectively uncoordinated. All 3 of those assumptions have been invalidated in less than 3 weeks. Turkey is no longer simply defending a border. It is projecting the architecture of a new regional security framework outward. Azerbaijan is no longer simply managing a bilateral relationship with Tehran. It is an active participant in a coordinated response structure whose operational scope is still expanding. Pakistan is no longer a distant eastern variable. It is potentially an operational partner in a strategic encirclement that Tehran has never had to model or counter. The signals to watch from here are specific and concrete. Will the Nakhchivan exercise discussions produce a formal announced timeline? If they do, that represents a qualitative escalation in Turkey-Azerbaijan military integration that diplomatic messaging cannot reverse. Will Pakistan confirm participation at the official level? Even a carefully worded non-denial would be informative about where Islamabad's calculations are heading. Will displacement figures along the Turkish-Iranian border climb to the point that Turkey activates the formal buffer zone infrastructure that has been prepared? That activation would mark the transition from reactive crisis management to the implementation of operational doctrine, permanently redefining the geography of the frontier. Watch the Kurachik radar. Watch whether the Patriot deployment from Ramstein is designated as temporary or assigned an extended operational status. Every decision about infrastructure permanence and forward basing tells you more about how Turkey and NATO assess the duration and scale of the threat than any official statement will. Iran wanted to demonstrate that it could not be cornered. Instead, it activated the precise defensive systems it most needed to avoid triggering, accelerated the military coordination it most needed to prevent, and created the humanitarian conditions that now provide both the justification and the operational rationale for a regional security architecture that will constrain its strategic options across its most vulnerable frontiers for years to come. The missiles intercepted over Turkish airspace on March 4th, March 9th, and March 13th never reached their targets. But they accomplished something that their intended targets could never have achieved independently. They built a coalition. And that coalition is still assembling. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.